start with a story. Some time ago, I joined a company as director of product. I inherited a small existing team and a bunch of open recs. It was for an enterprise company that had a product with a fairly high price point, a really complex value prop. And so our challenge was to figure out how we might actually increase leads, increase awareness, and obviously drive sales. We were doing a bunch of brainstorming, and a C-suite stakeholder at one point during the meeting said, "I have a straw man for you." He then proceeded to outline a really specific solution framework based on his understanding of the market, based on his conversations with customers. Noted, along with all the other ideas, I put that in the hopper and considered it for evaluation. But in subsequent meetings, he kept on coming back to it over and over again, asking like when it might be done, how we'd evolve the solution, what have we started to do in terms of resourcing, and some of the commitments he was already making to the customer. It took me by surprise. Until one of the existing team members pulled me aside and said, when he suggests a straw man, he's not really suggesting. And so I had this realization that I was new to this industry. He obviously knew a lot more than I did, so I adopted his plan. That didn't quite fit well with me. Had we explored enough ideas? Had I done enough primary research of my own? Had there been sufficient evaluation? And more so, what kind of culture am I creating for my team if that's how we prioritize work? It didn't work out. The solution did create a whole lot more leads, but they were largely unqualified, and that really frustrated the sales team. So I thought to myself, how do I learn from this? And ended up building a survey, and I've been doing a bunch of research with a ton of product managers to try to figure out how endemic are these sorts of issues in the industry. So I'm going to focus on three cognitive biases today that I think are pretty common, that most of you have probably faced and won't be a big surprise to you. But I think it's a great reminder to think about how prevalent they are in the industry and what we can actually go do about it. You might recognize on the screen, this is a more famous example of authority bias. This is Milgram's obedience experiment in Yale in 1961. You may know about it, but basically a perceived authority figure orders subjects to shock recipients. The shocks were fake, but the subjects didn't know that. And they almost always blindly obliged. Sometimes I feel like that in product management. Sometimes I'm not quite sure what side of the dial I'm on either. So my definition in the context of product management around authority bias is a manager, key customer, or other person in a position of power or expertise, perceived or real, may assert information to be true or a course of action to be the correct path. And the tendency is we skip critical assessment of their directive, perhaps out of deference to their authority, and over eagerness to please them, or an assumption they have all the facts. So what kind of data is coming back about authority bias? This survey is across all product managers of all levels of seniority, size, and industry. The survey is actually ongoing, so the data set is continuing to grow. So I'm going to share with you some early trends that are emerging, and so don't quote a lot of this data without checking in on an update. First of all, 60% of product managers are reporting experiencing authority bias as defined, often or always in their company, in their current company. A third of them believe that their company actually handles it very, very poorly, in that there's no real mechanisms to really undermine or overcome that authority bias. 95% agree that they have fast-tracked a feature, not because of the value that would create, but because of who was asking for it. Half of them have accommodated those features late in the development and skipped the usual prioritization and evaluation and discovery phases to ship them. And they frequently don't actually believe in them. And 2 out of 3 product managers agreed that at the end of the day, stakeholders' opinions rule the day when deciding product priorities. So I thought that was pretty interesting, pretty shocking. The good news is about 50% agree, and increasingly, this number is increasing over time, comfortable and empowered to challenge those senior members. So I got an example for you of where I actually overcame authority bias. I was working as interim head of product for a mobile application, a social networking mobile application. It was actually the largest in its segment. It was a fairly niche product, but it did have millions of daily active users and a very sizable subscriber base of 400,000. Each, on average, spending 90 minutes with the product a day. And of the subscribers, they were about a 5% conversion rate, which is one of the highest I've heard of, and each spending about $100 a year on the product. So pretty significant business. However, they were really struggling in some unique ways. First of all, they hadn't launched a new product in 2 years. The fundamental root cause was everything was being funneled up to the CEO and founder, who incidentally had started the company because he saw himself with a problem and was very much the target customer. And so as a result, there was a lot of passion and very much he saw himself as the target customer. We had also tons and tons of feature requests. So as a result, those features were being added to already in-flight product development. There was a bottleneck with getting decisions made, and as a result, 2 years was not a surprise. So what did we do? Well, what's the opposite of opinion? Data. Now this guy was very, very much an intuitive thinker. And so our solution initially started with balancing his qualitative thinking and intuitive thinking with the qualitative data from the user base. We made it very simple. It was a very small team. One of the biggest concerns with changing things up this drastically was the investment and potentially slowing us down even further. So we made it simple. Simply by 5 users coming in every week with minimal preparation, whatever the issue du jour was, that would be what we would tackle with them. And it would be very directionally useful, but essentially it meant that we were able to now talk on the same level as the stakeholder with actual words that the users were using. And secondly, to unblock this issue with shipping product and also to become more quantitatively driven, we launched a 3-stage beta, which allowed us to really reduce the risk down to like 1,000 users per beta phase and really set KPI goals before we even started, which elevated the whole conversation from being much about features and risks into here's the goals, here's the outcomes and the tolerances that we expect on the counter metrics, and so long as we're within those, we're able to be successful. What happened? The team immediately felt empowered to challenge opinion because they now had some data. We actually massively de-scoped a lot of features because we were able to show that by focusing and launching the betas, we were actually on track to hit our metrics. And within 3 months, we had launched the new version with a significant revenue lift. In World War II, aircraft losses were high. To reduce losses, the Allied forces studied planes that returned from battle to discern new armor placements. They found that bullet holes on the wingtips, in the center of the plane and on the tail. And so they started to armor the planes on those areas where the bullet holes were more frequent. What they hadn't factored in was the damage on the planes that didn't return, the ones that were at the bottom of the ocean. By neglecting the bullet holes on lost planes, they actually missed armoring planes' most vulnerable areas, which happened to be where the bullet holes are not, the engines. That was where they had to be working. This is an example, famous example of survivor bias. Though the data you have, that's what you will make the decisions on, but the data you don't have, the absence of that data, you don't necessarily make great decisions without filling that in. My definition of survivor bias in the product management context, it's basically a common flaw, particularly bedeviling the customer research, user behavior analysis, and user testing. And that's around concentrating on your efforts on those who are most active with your product. These users are generally more positive about your product. They're more visible, they're more easily reached to, typically more responsive. And as a result, they tend to get overrepresented in your data. Here's a couple of examples. Onboarding and adoption. Those that make it through those phases, you talk to because they're using your product successfully. But those that dropped out in the first 5 minutes are examples of users that you're probably not talking to, and that's an example of survivor bias. Another example is companies that are currently optimizing for paid advertising through social and through search are sending signal back to those companies. And that signal is being used to target ever more smaller set of prospects to get efficiency, which means that the company is acquiring the same users over and over again and largely ignoring the needs of a much larger market. As a result, their growth stalls. In the research I did, I broke out consumer apps and enterprise apps, and we dug into some of the key factors that are informing the inputs to product managers' prioritization decisions. On consumer apps, not surprisingly, behavioral analytics of current users dominated constantly. That's probably a good thing. We should be looking at the plethora of data that Google Analytics and other, like Amplitude and other tools have brought to us, but it's insufficient. If you only look at that, that's a form of survivor bias. Only 1 in 3 agreed that they had ranked disengaged users as a top 3 source. In other words, out of all of the lists that we gave them, the disengaged users or elapsed users, the ones who aren't using your product but once tried, were not actually being talked to. And almost 60% admitted at the current company they had rarely or never participated in an interview with a dissatisfied customer. Pretty shocking. Enterprise products didn't fare so well either. Direct requests from existing customers, in particular those really highly motivated, dominated across the board. Again, probably not all that surprising. Probably the way it should be, so long as those requests aren't super prescriptive, one-off solutions, and the product manager is actually empowered to step back and think about the solution to the root cause problem, it's probably okay. 2/3 don't actually look at user behavior analysis, so they're not thinking about the onboarding, adoption, and engagement phases of their product. And they agreed that they make investments in those areas only occasionally or less than occasionally. And even more shocking, only 12% reported talking to and making a priority disengaged or elapsed customers. So the customers that stopped using your enterprise solution, actually understanding why and solving those problems was not a priority for them. Here's a quick example of survivor bias. This is a SaaS solution. It was a company that was doing a franchise management solution. I will not go into too much detail because it's kind of a complicated market, but essentially you have the franchisees. Franchisees often have multiple locations and some have a single location. This tool enabled all sorts of communication, process rollout, brand management, operational practices, and supply chain. It was a very sales-driven culture, so they sold that solution to anyone. They had actually grown the company pretty successfully that way. Unfortunately, they'd also had a lot of single location and few location customers, so the kind of the low end. Their customer responsiveness was excellent. They actually had it wasn't like they just did anything the customer asked. They actually had a great process for bringing in customer requests and trying to make sure that they were the right thing to be working on. The problem was, and I should say that the founder in this case had been a franchisee and he really understood the pain. And he felt for every single one of those small business owners and wanted them to be successful, which was a real value that had permeated the entire culture. Problem, by only focusing on their existing customers for guiding their priorities, the urgent always displaced the important longer-term strategic things. Example also of trying to serve everyone, you serve no one. Solution, focus, making some tough calls. So we had to up-level the conversation around who are we really wanting to be. We decided that the home services multi-tenant franchise market was the most interesting. We actually encouraged churn of our more demanding single location customers. Even if they were marginally profitable, it was actually better from an opportunity cost perspective that they left. And we actually went through the list and we encouraged them sometimes onto competitive solutions. And we balanced this sales-driven culture by also emphasizing downstream adoption and usage metrics that showed that we were being successful in a multi-location franchise environment in driving adoption. Secondly, we structured how the portfolio would be managed and the different streams of work, which shrunk down the amount of time and development resources we would put on customer requests. Couldn't be zero, but we still allow for that. But it just required more discipline, and it meant we went slower on that. And then we focused on what did we believe, from a roadmap perspective, were the right delighters and needs to serve the home services market. The results? Within only 1 quarter, we delivered not only a platform and a product that now spoke to a very clear segment, we actually also had a much longer sales roadmap, which is obviously very important to sell into the market, not just what you have, but what's coming soon. We'd successfully had 2 beachhead large-scale referenceable customers, and we'd shrunk that single location client base. Painful, but we did it. Unfortunately, the pivot came too late, and the company ran out of runway. Google's Project Aristotle is a landmark study of teamwork and team performance. It started in 2012, and they published their findings a couple of years ago. They had identified 5 factors underlying team success. They were the impact of work on the business and customers, the meaning of the work, how important is that to me, the structure and clarity of the work, goals, clear process, and understanding of what the outcomes are meant to be, dependability, how much can I rely on my teammates and is there mutual accountability, and psychological safety. Can I take risks in my team? By far, psychological safety, a phrase that's been coined by Harvard professor Amy Edmondson, won out. It was the most important thing by far. Basically defined as a shared belief that the team is a safe environment for interpersonal risk-taking and confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish. Now, while reputation risk is not the opposite of psychological safety, it's a product when you don't have it. Reputation risk is as you propose and communicate support for an approach, you become personally invested in it. It's very easy to fall in love with your own ideas. That's a halo effect. Or you may see the failing of something that you've supported as a reflection on your personal failings. In a reputational risk environment, you see a lot of defensibility and inflexibility. You redact data that's contradicting your beliefs, and you tend to look for data that supports it. Or the team just takes fewer risks in the first place. So how prevalent is reputation risk? Well, we asked this question. I would describe my company as one where failure is embraced as learning and taking risks is actively encouraged. I was encouraged to see that 60% of respondents actually agreed with that statement or strongly agreed with that statement, which is a great outcome. We have a way to go because almost a quarter do not see this as their company as an environment where they can take risks. What are some of the behaviors that we saw correlated with higher psychological safety? A willingness and welcomeness to challenge when you have doubts, 63%. Prototyping, validating, and iterating around a solution as a process, as opposed to building the solution from the outset, was 49% of them. Willing to roll back a product feature or a product when it's not hitting business metrics, not technical failure, but actually when it's not hitting your business metrics, 33%. A regular behavior around holding retrospectives and 5 whys to get to root causes of issues and going and actually fixing those root causes, 40%. And celebrating even when things don't work out. They were a learn fast organization, not fail fast, don't like that term. They were a learn fast organization because even failure was an opportunity to learn from that. and celebrate, literally celebrate, when they had learned something, even if they had to roll something back. Here's an example. I was head of product for a company, and we had a conversion optimization team for a subscription business. Essentially, we were trying to get A/B testing and experiments to see whether or not we could increase our conversion rate from about 1% to see if we can get to 1.4, 1.5. We had a very high visibility conversion rate KPI across the business, and a team allocated to that, and we were reporting on that very regularly. We were historically a very top-down, lower trust environment. Obviously, as a product leader, I was trying to change that culture. But that put the team in an anxious area because now they had ownership for this very big goal, no clear path to get there, and a lot of attention in an environment that didn't have psychological safety. What happened? Well, they tried safe ideas, only safe ideas. Every idea has to work, is then what they thought that we were asking them to do. Furthermore, even when they wanted to do A/B testing, we weren't going fast enough because there was such concern on even impacting like 5% of users that often those tests were so small. And as a result, over 6 months, we'd spent a whole typical team, product manager, designer, engineers, and we had extremely marginal gains from that. And there was questions whether or not the team was being successful and whether or not we should wind them down. Solution? Change the goal was the first one. Counterintuitively, starting by taking off the table this big, audacious goal that was making them super anxious about doing value for the business. It's quite counterintuitive when you think about driving to outcomes. But we instead replaced that goal with test velocity. We called it at-bats. The number of swings you have, the better. And then this notion of an idea mix portfolio. We wanted to see a mix of smaller ideas and bigger swings. The second thing we did is we really worked on the team's culture. So we talked about switching up the ideation process from this small ideas, lots of critique, lots of that's not going to work kind of behavior, to let's just go for volume. Let's just try to get big ideas. Where can we go get those big ideas from? We emphasized learning as an outcome to be celebrated, and we wrote down product principles around being hypothesis-driven, that speed and iteration is of the essence, and that failing is okay. What are the outcomes? Well, just by doing that, we built confidence and momentum within the team. We saw the velocity pick up very, very quickly, but even more subtly, the team felt comfortable in an environment, not in a comfort zone. They felt challenged, but they were in a learning zone. They were actually excited about the opportunity. They were no longer anxious. The throughput, both of ideas tested and the breadth of those ideas, drove up a lot, and guess what? We hit our goal. Now, I must say that it was impossible to change the organizational culture, but changing the team's environment was possible. So I challenge you to look through each of these definitions and reflect back on what are you facing in your environment that may be hampering your ability to be successful as product managers or as product management leaders. And a couple of key things to take away. It's naive to suggest that stakeholders and customer requests can be ignored or ever not a major part of your product investment. But the key is to strike a balance and really structure how those things get evaluated alongside everything else. They shouldn't go through a separate process just because they're coming from stakeholders or customers. Secondly, when you're faced with lots and lots of exciting data to dig into, step back and ask yourself first, where is the absence of data? What don't I know? And then go get what you can. It's not going to be as complete as your data set, but it's going to start balancing things out. And then finally, it's not that hard to encourage a psychologically safe environment. Start talking about hypothesis-led learning, calculated risk-taking, celebrate everything, and as a leader, don't ever forget that it's super powerful to say, I'm wrong. So, in conclusion, look out for your business voltmeters and keep the shocks down low. Despite the bullet-ridden product planes limping back to land, think about the ones that might be at the bottom of the ocean and protect that psychological safety of your team above all other attributes, even impact, even the meaning of work, even the structure. So you encourage them to thrive and challenge themselves, each other, and you in their learnings. And finally, watch out for those straw men. They're scaring away better ideas and more powerful solutions. Thank you.